Yes, okay. First mistake, I hadn't opened the mic for the students at home. So I will again say welcome everybody to this course. And for the students who are connected from remote, if you want to ask for clarifications or if you want to join the discussion, please write in the chat. The chat will be always open on my screen, so I will see what you write. It might be that I don't answer immediately, but that's only because I usually wait for having finished whatever I'm saying before taking questions, which is also true for the students who are in class. Now, again, as last year, this course will be delivered in a hybrid format. Most of the people attending this year are in class, which is really nice to see, I think. And this is also a sign that we are going back to normality. Let me begin by introducing myself. My name is Guido Alfani. Buongiorno. I am an economic historian here at Bocconi. I double up as a historical demographer, and I sometimes work at the crossroads between disciplines. My current research is mostly on long-run trends in inequality, although I am also now adding another dimension, which is that of social mobility. I have been lucky enough to receive substantial funding from the European Union in the Consolidated Research Grant Program, which is part of the what is currently the main program for funding research at the level of the Union, and maybe I will show you some of the results here and then during this course. Anyway, my other specialization is on the history of past pandemics. This was very interesting to me from well before COVID-19. This is kind of reflected in the program for this course because beginning last year, we introduced a specific lecture on pandemics and divergence, which I think is pretty interesting given the situation in we currently are, right? Because part of the discussion about the economic consequences of COVID-19 has to do with its possible impact on the long-run relative trends of different regions of the world. Now, I also do hope that everybody, including the people in class, can listen when I talk because this kind of mask is a bit taxing on my voice. I hope to be able to survive the whole lecture speaking with this on my face because it's not, not the easiest thing in the world. Although by now we have some experience with this. Now, I'm always available to talk to you also after class about this course or about any other matter you would like to discuss with me. In general, I am available to talk with students immediately after class, which tends to work very well because it's also quick for you. But beginning this year, I will go back to the good old tradition of having physical office hours. Now, physical office hours have become a little bit complicated during COVID for obvious reasons. I think we can do that again. So the other option you have is to come directly to my office hours. I will include a full list, but generally speaking, I will have office hours immediately after our Tuesday class. So the slot I will focus on is 2 to 3 p.m. on Tuesdays. This also means in practice that you could also start talking with me at the end of class, then walk with me to my office and we continue there. In the case it's a big question, we have plenty of things to discuss or whatever. Okay? So in general, you can simply come after lecture to talk to me or even send me a message and tell me like, I need more time to discuss things with you, but I can't come on Tuesdays, whatever, and then we will find a way around that. It's not like in this course we have like 200 students, so it's something which is possible to do because the numbers are manageable. Now, the other thing which unfortunately I don't believe it's possible to do yet, the other good old tradition is the syllabus, which I usually distributed in class at the beginning of the lecture. I don't think this is compliant with the COVID regulations, basically. So I couldn't print this out for you. But be aware of the fact that if you go to the Blackboard page of this course, you will find the updated syllabus. And this is a detailed version of the syllabus with teaching material and general topic lecture by lecture, with all the dates and whatever, right? And also a summary of the regulations and rules about the examination for this course. And I will go back to that issue later today because we will also talk about that as a way of introducing different aspects of this course. And the other things that you will find there are the actual slides for each lecture. Now, I commit to upload the slides in the Blackboard space before the lecture, but as I am sometimes revising the lecture till the very end, this means that I commit to upload the slides even maybe 1 hour before the lecture, okay? So usually this will be some days in advance or the day before, and the day before will be the case when you look for the material presented on Tuesdays, because I will upload them on Monday, basically. I think that last year some students had problems using Mac and downloading the PowerPoint. So maybe I will upload the PowerPoint and PDF version of all lectures just to make things simpler. So that's possibly the problems minimization strategy which we might follow. We have a teaching assistant for this course, who is Benedetta Crivelli, who is there. Benedetta, if you want to introduce yourself.
We are in Bocconi. I'm here to discuss for an issue about regarding the Blackboard and books and other things. So my email is benedetta.crivelli@unibocconi.it.
Maybe you can.
And I don't have any office hour, but if you write me an email, we fix an appointment for any talk.
Thank you, Benedetta. Did any among you find this in the Blackboard and download it? Yes. When? When did you do that? This morning. Oh, this is probably fine because I made a slight edit, which is the following. Well, I will tell you now. Now, let me say something in general about how this course is structured. I have been a program director in this university for 7 years. I was the director of the program in Economic and Social Sciences. I think that the relative majority of the students attending this course are from that program. And something I know very well is that in May, you all are going to have a lot of exams to take. So what I do in this course is to concentrate a bit, as much as I can, the, reading material in the first half of the course. So you will have a very intense first part of the course till March. Then, in the second half of the course, we will also have some lectures specifically dedicated to the presentation in class of the research project. This means that the second half of the course, in terms of teaching material, reading material, sorry, is lighter, which is reflected in a different weight given to the 2 partial exams, right? The first partial exam weighs 40% of the final mark. The second partial exam, related only to the program for the second half of the course after the break, weighs 25%. Now, your colleagues in years past like this, and I'm telling you, this means you have a somehow lighter second partial exam. And as a program director, I know that this is in fact quite helpful. Okay, but this also means that again, if you look at the syllabus, the title syllabus, you see that we have a very intense first part of the course. We will begin with an introduction today and tomorrow. Tomorrow we will talk about prehistory, if you want, what happens with the so-called Neolithic Revolution about 10 to 12,000 years ago. And then we will begin with our big topics, which are the Great Divergence and the Little Divergence to begin with. So the Great Divergence will be the first big topic we will cover. This is the divergence between certain world areas, in particular in Western Europe, and the most advanced areas of the rest of the world, in particular in East Asia, from a certain moment in time, which, according to the scholar, who you might ask, varies from in between the 14th century and the beginning of the, well, and in fact, and the early 19th century, when the Industrial Revolution really takes up speed. And the timing of the Great Divergence is not neutral at all regarding the interpretation of this phenomenon. And we will discuss this in detail. Then the Little Divergence, which instead has to do with a smaller scale, geographically, because this has to do with Europe. This is the process leading the Northern European areas, taking over the Southern European areas, which had been the center, the focus of the European and Mediterranean economy till that moment in time. As it happens, the center of the European economy was central northern Italy from antiquity, from Roman times, in fact, from the times of the Roman Empire, till, well, depends, again, whom you ask, till in between the beginning of the 16th or the beginning of the 17th century. In this case, there is less variation in the beginning or in the period when different people think this process begins. But also in this case, as we will discuss in detail, timing is important if we start thinking about the causes and the features, the characteristics of this process. And then we will discuss some specific factors, again, in the first part of the course, like pandemics as possible factor leading to long-run divergence. We'll discuss culture, we'll discuss a bunch of other things, and then we will move to pre-industrial inequality, okay? So, the first part of the course is strictly pre-industrial. You could think that this is a lot of attention given to the long run. It might be. This is a specificity of this course, but there are two things to bear in mind. First thing is, if you really are interested in understanding the possible long-run roots of certain features of the modern world, you need to take a very broad historical perspective. And by broad, I mean chronologically broad. And this is a point I will repeatedly make during this course. Otherwise, you observe things which are important, but are only very partial, and you might miss, in fact, what might be the most important thing to find, to see in this whole process. Or at least this is kind of the idea behind this approach. Second point, for those of you who have taken a bachelor here at Bocconi, in general, the course in economic history was compulsory, and the Industrial Revolution should have been the main topic. Usually we have an introduction with the pre-industrial, a lot of industrialization stuff, and then something about the post-industrial revolution period, the 20th century, and then into the 21st century. The Industrial Revolution, I will tell you again in this course in a future lecture, is in a sense the elephant in the room, because I don't have time to talk to you about that. So I kind of give that you know at least something about the Industrial Revolution already, you know, these general features, because there are no prerequisites for this course. But if you have never taken a course in economic history and you don't think you know much about the Industrial Revolution, you might wish to come to me, and then I will give you something very quick to read just to have an idea, right? And this means that when we will move into the second part of the course, in fact, as you can find in the syllabus, we will again we will continue to have this very broad perspective, but we will quickly move into the late 19th and the 20th century, focusing then on, for example, the trends in inequality in the last 50 to 60 years, beginning when certain processes of decline inequality began with World War I, in fact, and then inequality resumes growing, leading to much concern in today's societies. Now, and also as part of this second part of the course, we will also try and say something about a world area which we will cover little in other moments, where we will talk about it a bit tomorrow, but in general, we will not say much about Africa, save for one specific lecture on Africa, which is a very, by Africa here I mean sub-Saharan Africa, because this is a very interesting case because the problem is why Africa was left behind. So this becomes kind of a case study in why this area always seems to be lagging behind from pretty early on. And in fact, as we will see tomorrow, one possibility is that this historical process, this historical development actually has pretty ancient roots. Now, I was mentioning the fact that I made a little change to the program this morning because I realized that I hadn't updated the second guest lecture. So we'll have a first guest lecture in the first part of the course delivered by Benedetta, because Benedetta, she's an expert on the Atlantic trade, and this is the topic she will discuss with you. In the second part of the course, last year, we had Professor Vonio, who is also here at Bocconi, who is an expert in the economic consequences of the world wars, and he delivered a lecture on the economic impact of World War I and World War II. But Professor Vonio is on sabbatical this year. So I'm still thinking about how to do this, but just to anticipate something which I will be able to confirm tomorrow, maybe, I think we might have a guest delivering a lecture on American capitalism with long-run perspective, meaning in this case from the 19th to the 20th century, and also a view of also keeping in mind its global impact, which again is something that is very interesting to explore historically because it is again very much part of current debates. Now, if you look at the syllabus, you will find that there are a number of books singled out at the end, usually, well, always in fact, with a specific indication of the chapters that you're expected to cover. And in the detail of the syllabus, you also find which chapter is supposed to be related to which lecture, right? The difference between the program for attending and not attending students is that not attending students have to cover in full the books by Pomeranz and the book by Milanovic, worlds apart. So they have many more chapters, but they don't do the research project, the team, the group work, and don't do, of course, the presentation in class. This is something which is reserved to attending students. Now, in this list, you will also find 3 short chapters from the book by Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel, which are mostly related to our lecture tomorrow. Now, these are not currently available to you through the course reserve, I think, but they will very soon be available to you in electronic format as well. Only the chapters, because Bocconi doesn't have access to the full book in electronic format, unless something changed in the last few weeks, but I don't think so, okay? Regarding the other books instead, for all of them, you have free access through the library to the electronic edition. And on top of that, you can find in the library many copies available for loan, or you can find a copy in the Egea bookshop if you want to have a physical copy, right? But the point is, you will have access to all these material in electronic format directly from Bocconi and for free, basically. There will be some other material related to specific lectures, which I will, maybe a few articles, which I will upload together with the slides of the lecture by lecture. The reason why I haven't singled out every additional reading now is that I always update the course a bit, so I might change some of the readings. The important thing is that you will know well before each exam which is the full list of the readings included in that exam. So at the end, you will have a list related to the first part, which those of you who are willing to take the first partial exam in March, I think, it's March, yes, it's March, will have to cover, and another list which relates to the second part of the course. And of course, the general exam will be a mixture of the two. This is an exceedingly silent class. Is everything clear so far? Okay. We will talk about the exam at the end of this lecture. So if you have questions about the program, you can ask them now, you can ask them later. If you have questions about me, you can ask them now. If you don't have questions, okay, I will ask questions later during this lecture. And again, I remind the people at home that you are entitled to ask questions. Write them in the chat. Okay, so let's begin the proper lecture. By the way, please remember to record your attendance to the class, both the students who are physically in class now and those who are abroad. Yes? Okay. So it's not being updated, the attendance. You know where we should do that? Da qua? Class attendance. Oof. Okay. My apologies, but maybe you know that we have changed again the platform for managing the courses, which was kind of newish because it changed 2 years ago. So my expectation was, okay, it's going to be the same. No, it's different. Not necessarily superior to the older one. I'm sure it's more expensive, but not necessarily superior, at least for the purposes of this course. So now you should be able, you did that? Okay, fantastic. You should be able to record your attendance. This is important also for Bocconi, for knowing about the occupation, the degree of occupation, of physical occupation of the classroom, whatever. There is a bunch of COVID-related reasons for doing this. It's important to a point for this course because I have been in touch with a few among you, some of you who have problems with attending maybe one of the 2 lectures because overlaps or whatever. We can find a way to organize this. By the way, you have seen that as we had a few lectures to recover because of, I don't know, the 25th of April, which was a holiday, because our course begins on a Monday, our course is usually on Mondays and Tuesdays, so the first week we didn't have a lecture, whatever. I have added a few lectures on 3 Tuesdays before our usual lecture, right? So usually it's Monday and Tuesday in the usual time. There are already 3 lectures with a different timing. If you have to move other lectures, we have in fact 1 to add because of Easter and all this stuff. We have 1 lecture without a specific date, and I think we might see in class whether there is a slot which kind of minimizes your inconvenience, basically. I wanted to have all the lectures for the first part already fixed before we began this, because as I said, it's important that we cover that material in the first part of the course in order to be able to have this kind of more engaging midterm exam. But more engaging now means less troublesome in May, basically. And of course, you can come directly to the general exam if you don't want to take the partial exams. My recommendation is always to take the partial exams. at least the first, then you can always drop that if you don't like and then come to the general. But if you can do this, in the specific case of this course, this helps quite a bit because, again, a lighter second exam in May, it can be very helpful, depending, of course, on your personal schedule of exams, but in many cases, I know from experience that it helps. Now, as you know, this is a course which is organized around 3 very broad keywords: globalization, divergence, and inequality. Globalization is the process which leads to the emergence of what we refer to as the global economy, which in a sense is intuitive, but it's a little bit more difficult to define, as we will see shortly, because there are different sides of this process which you might want to stress. For example, there is a cultural side and there is an economic side. It's not only an economic process. There are different facets in this complex phenomenon. Divergence, instead, in the context of this course, refers to the process leading certain world areas to become much richer, but not only, also, for example, more powerful militarily. And the issue of military power as it relates to long-run divergence is a fairly sensible issue, and we will not shy away from also touching upon that every now and then, also because in this course, all the people who participate to this course, meaning all of you, plus me and Benedetta, you are all entitled to have your own opinion about pretty much whatever. But of course, when you talk about, myself, when you talk about historical facts, whatever a historical fact actually is, if you have an opinion different from mine, it's fine, but you have to motivate it, right? So when you think about the basics, and then about the interpretation instead, we will see for pretty much everything which we cover, different way of interpreting the same phenomenon, and in some cases, it's really difficult, if not impossible, based on our current, on the currently available evidence, right, to say this hypothesis is false and this other might be right instead. It's very difficult. So to some degree, it's a matter of, also not really of preference, but of discussing which possible interpretation between many might seem more convincing to each of you in the end. Now, and again, military power is surely not the most sensible topic which we cover in this course. There are a bunch, and this is always the case when you talk about inequality, by the way, which in certain countries especially has become a very sensitive issue, also in connection to political discourse. Now, when we talk about inequality, we will look at 2 different kinds of inequality. Inequality within countries or regions, so inequality between the households or individuals who belong to a given society, and inequality between regions, right? As you will see in this course, this is also a matter of measurement, because inequality, in the meaning which we give it to in this course, is something that you have to try and measure somehow. And the way in which you measure inequality is not neutral, but maybe more importantly, when you want to measure different dimensions of inequality, you need to use different tools. Now, this is not a course which is ever going to be heavy in statistics, right? There is only one topic for which we will also have some brief discussion of simple statistical methods, mostly descriptive statistics, or if you want, indexes used to measure in different ways inequality, and that's inequality is the topic. So for inequality, I will introduce some basic measures like the Gini index or the Theil index, and I will also maybe provide you with some hands-on material which can allow you to do some exploration on your own, And this might be useful for the purpose of your final group work. And we'll talk about that later. Now, let's go back to our first keyword. As I told you, globalization is a multifaceted process. Now, I've been talking a lot with this mask, so now I want a volunteer for reading this definition of cultural globalization. And the volunteer is? Thank you. Okay, fantastic, thank you. What do you think about this? First, I mean, when you think about globalization, do you tend to think it's mostly an economic phenomenon, or do you think from the very beginning that this is also something which has to do big time with culture? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So basically you are saying it's a phenomenon which is at its core economic, but it also has a cultural character, right? You? Yeah, I think this is totally correct. So we are like, I mean, think about this as a gem, right, with many facets. You want to describe each facet, but we shouldn't forget that these are the facets of the same gem, right? So the point is exactly that. You have a cultural side which influences the economic side, and an economic side which influences the cultural side continuously. Now, the not maybe very smart example I make in this course is this cultural artifact. This cultural artifact is an iPhone, so the produce of an evil multinational company called Apple, which doesn't pay me for mentioning it in this course, by the way. But the point is that, I mean, the fact that this item is sold in with pretty much the same characteristics, feature, colors around the world. Right. Does this tell us something about globalization? Along the lines of your two colleagues, basically, the point here is the following. It's not a given that I can sell exactly the same thing around the world first. The fact that I can do that now means that the market for mobile phones is influenced, is kind of permeated by a culture which allows to accept this item with exactly the same features around the world. It's not like I need to produce, I mean, beyond, of course, localizing the software in whatever language you want. But it's not like I have to produce a physically different item for each market I want to sell this into. And this is not a given. It's not even something which today happens for everything. You can't sell the same frozen pizza you find in the US in Italy, or not easily at least, for a bunch of reasons, cultural reasons, among which the objective fact that the Italian pizza is better, but this is a joke. Okay, this is a joke. So you see the point, but this you can sell in the same way. And the problem then becomes, will this lead us to all think and buy and act in the same way or not? Now, the way in which the issue was posed 30 years ago, so at the onset of the current wave of globalization, was pretty different because, or even 40 years ago, because then there was kind of a stronger feeling that this might have brought all of humankind in the end to kind of have some more common cultural features, everybody wanting to buy the same thing with the same features independently from local traditions and whatever. But already 20 years ago, it was already clear this wasn't happening. So the point is, what happens with the iPhone or whatever mobile phone you might want, right, is not the same which happens in other areas. And if you look at this closely, you find that the process doesn't seem to lead towards real homogenization. There will be things which are kind of accepted worldwide. Things will be kind of interesting or shared in broad areas, but not globally. And the way in which the same item, for example, is used in a given area might be different from the way in which it is used in another area, and that also has to do with the culture of each area, okay? And of course, this also has an impact, which is an economic impact. This also is relevant for people working in marketing, for example, because true, you sell the same iPhone everywhere, but the advertising you do for that iPhone might not be the same everywhere, because you want to tap into different cultural features of different areas. So this definition of cultural globalization, which is relatively recent, this is 2016, and consider that there are many possible definitions of this concept. So I'm taking one definition for cultural globalization, one definition for economic globalization, because I think they kind of work decently well, but it's not like these definitions are written in stone. Like this is something that you might find in different variants. But this is kind of quite open in addressing these issues. So there are homogenizing influences, and that's what allows you to sell the same item in certain cases worldwide. But this is very far from creating anything similar to a unified world culture. And this even supposing that globalization is a process which will continue at pretty much the same speed which we have known so far. Now, when we think about cultural globalization, so reciprocal influences, reciprocal cultural influences somehow connected to economic processes, we can, in fact, take a pretty long-run perspective again. So this is how Japanese artists portray the arrival of Portuguese ships in Japan in 1543. The arrival of the Japanese of the Portuguese in Japan was, according to the story which we are fed, so which is supposedly right, but some uncertainty might remain, was a kind of mistake. They wanted to get into a Chinese harbor, and then a storm brought them to Japan instead. And when they arrived there, they became a curiosity because they were pretty different from the other people that the Japanese had seen before. 1543, this was really new. And this led to a development of a whole branch of artistic production called Namban art, which was the Japanese portrayal of Europeans in Japan. This is a very nice, by the way, artistic production. I like it a lot. And again, this tells us something because, for example, the Japanese artists were portraying in great detail the way in which the Portuguese were dressed. At the same time, the Portuguese merchants, who apparently by mistake arrived in Japan, immediately realized that there was a lot which Japan produced, which might have been interesting for the Europeans. So, you know, this reciprocal cultural interest is also something which led to economic opportunities, which contributed to fuel the Atlantic trade routes. Atlantic because, of course, the Portuguese, to arrive in Japan, had to circumnavigate Africa. This was the path taken by the Portuguese, as we will see later on in the course. And the two people started becoming more aware one of the other. And some elements of art, for example, of East Asian art were then to be found in Europe and vice versa. And then the story is more complicated because Japan, at a certain point in time, decides to try and keep this external influence outside the Japanese eyes for basically internal reasons. So we will discuss this because we have much to say. There are people who said, well, you know, the Japanese were showing an aversion to becoming involved with global dynamics. Not necessarily true. They were coming from a long period of civil wars, and they came to the conclusion that the presence of the Europeans in Japan had destabilizing effects for the country, and decided that they wanted to preserve stability and also, incidentally, the political power of the ruling Tokugawa family. Okay, we will see that at a later point in the course, right? So again, culture is something that we will mention repeatedly in the course. And culture is important to these stories about globalization. Culture is also important to at least some of the interpretation of long-run divergence, because on principle, you could think that certain cultural features typical of different societies might favor or not economic development in the long run. If this is true, then you can conclude that, you know, areas having certain cultural traits will tend to grow more in relative terms in the long run compared to others. And there is a whole set of explanations for long-run divergence which are cultural in nature. Which is not to say that they are the only way of explaining this phenomenon, because it's not the case at all. We will study these interpretations together with others, and we will see whether you find them convincing or not. Now, when we get to economic globalization instead, we can focus on this definition. Economic globalization refers to the increasing interdependence of world economies as a result of the growing scale of cross-border trade of commodities and services, flow of international capital, and wide and rapid spread of technologies. It reflects the continuing expansion and mutual integration of market frontiers, and is an irreversible trend for the economic development in the whole world at the turn of the millennium. What do you think about this? And look at the date. This is old, 2000. What would you highlight in this definition of economic globalization? So we are looking only at the economic side of the story. So what is economic globalization? Any ideas? Any ideas? Yeah, fantastic. And also, your colleague from home, Luca Barbato, shares pretty much the same opinion because he's also highlighting increasing interdependence and irreversible. Now, I have to remember that people at home probably can't hear the students in class. I will have to remember to kind of repeat the comments you make, at least a very synthetic version for the people at home. So yes, now, increasing interdependence between what? Between world economies, plural. This is very important, in fact. The reason why this is important will become very clear to you when we will go through the discussion of the grid divergence, and we will discuss the concept of the world economy. Because the point here is that there are kind of different economic systems which are geographically centered, and they start becoming more interdependent. The idea is to the point of maybe becoming a single system properly global. But in this definition, this is still a process towards that outcome. Not only that, an irreversible process towards that outcome. Now, before focusing on this irreversible world, right, consider the importance of the free flow of capitals, the importance of the spread of technologies. This is descriptive of what happened in the last decades, right? The spread of technologies around the world, itself connected to the way in which the production chains have changed. Very important to consider now in a pandemic period, as we will discuss shortly, and so forth, and so on. Now, this slide I introduced a few years ago, well before COVID, and I introduced this slide when the then American President Donald Trump started developing a platform which was quite anti-globalization. So the point was, okay, we give for granted, I mean, when we normally think, right, in our everyday life, we tend to give for granted that what we know will continue to be the kind of development that we experience, so this increasing globalization, our increasing ability to, for example, travel to whatever angle of the world we can think, will continue to expand. But a troubling thought you might have, and we will discuss this in detail, is that the very same idea was shared by people, at least in the West, so in what was then the rich part of the world, on the eve of World War I. And then everything crumbled. And what had been a long way of globalization stopped for a period, right? And some areas of the world became separated from others, not only because of the world wars, but also because of the Russian Revolution, and then after World War II, with the division between blocks, the communist bloc and the Western bloc, say, which lasted for decades. And it wasn't possible to easily travel between the blocks, for example. Now, the point I used to make, was only that, globalization, if looked at historically, is a more fragile process that we might like to think. Not only that we might be used to think, but it's troubling to think that this might in fact end. Add COVID to this picture. During the pandemic, as you know, our ability to travel abroad has dramatically been constrained compared to what was the pre-pandemic situation. This has been a common experience for many people here, I'm sure. Not only, we discover that having global production chains, the so-called global chains of value, might become a problem in a pandemic era, in a pandemic period, sorry. Might become a problem. So what will happen in the future? Well, we don't know. There is some hints that at least in certain sectors, those chains will be shortened. But shortening a value chain means to make the process of production, whatever, less global. Okay? So again, this should give us pause. Now, also consider that COVID-19 is the first pandemic on a truly significant scale to affect the 21st, to affect the world in the 21st century. But this event was kind of expected. So only problem, most people expected a little influenza, not a coronavirus. So the point is, for those who work in this field, it's very clear that given the high population density of the world, the high level of interconnectedness of the world, the ease of travel, whatever, between different areas, another pandemic of a serious, caused by a potentially lethal pathogen is definitely a possibility. And this also might be in the mind of people who are thinking production chains of the future. Okay? So, again, irreversible, maybe, but at least with a question mark. Then, of course, this, maybe 50 years from now, we might identify in this period, for again, political and pandemic reasons, a period of slowing down of the process, and this might then seem only a glimpse in a general and clear trend, or we might find, maybe this is not very, say, probable, but on principle, you could think that we reached a tipping point, and after the degree of globalization, at least measured according to certain parameters, might be found in the future to have started declining. It's possible. So the point is, you need to be aware that the future is uncertain. Whenever you find what's like irreversible or certain or whatever, you should start asking whether that kind of judgment is really based on strong foundation. So it's simply like writing down what is, in the end, not much more than a simple gut feeling. And this is a kind of awareness that we want to develop in this course on purpose, because this is also some of the value added which you can get here. And you can get that value added only by looking at history in a very broad, long-run, comparative perspective. Okay, we have questions about these definitions. And again, remember that we could have used similar but different definitions. So it's not like there is one definition, everybody accepts that. Yes? In this slide? Okay. So, okay, so you're for the students at home, your colleague in class is asking about the last part of this question, why this process might be, in fact, a set of processes shaped by human agency. And the meaning of that is the following. We say globalization, first, we say globalization as if this would be, this is kind of a general monolithic process, but in fact, we could also look at different, different aspects of this, or even different processes that together we conceptualize as globalization. Now, this is basically, I mean, the point I want to make here concerning that specifically is that in the end, there are different aspects we want to consider. And then the way, I mean, whether we define them as different processes or we all make them fall under the label of globalization as a complex phenomenon, but kind of more encompassing, is partly a matter of rhetoric and partly a matter of our interpretation / personal judgment. Now, the other point is that these processes, however, are maybe deeply shaped by human agency, which means by the intentional decisions taken by human beings. When you say that a process is irreversible, you are kind of dehumanizing it, in the sense that it's no longer a matter of choice. If it is irreversible, it means that, you know, on principle, literally, it means that if all of us in the world decide we want to stop globalization, we can't, because it's irreversible, right? So if we take it at face value, it means we can't do anything about that. And I think that the author of that definition was actually thinking we can't do anything about that. Well, maybe. Because on principle, you could also say, yeah, but in the end, as this has to do with economics, the way in which production processes are organized, cultural manifestations and whatever, in the end, you find the decisions taken by individuals. But if you find decisions taken by individuals, on principle, you could imagine that those individuals change their mind and start acting in a different way. You want a simple example? What if globally political platforms strongly against globalization spread and they win the elections in whatever countries and they rule the world? I mean, each and every country in the world is ruled by a political coalition of some sort which has a strong anti-globalization platform, and the people in those societies actually agree with this. Well, presumably, you would find a decline in the level of globalization, however you measure it worldwide, okay? But if you make this thought experiment, you can't define this as irreversible. The way in which I introduced this discussion is, okay, let's look at this historical process from a very aggregate perspective. So we are being told that there is a certain direction in history, right? I was simply saying, well, historically, we have been there before, and then we went back. And according to certain parameters, the world was more globalized in 1914 than it is today, as we will see in the final lectures of this course, right? And secondly, there are signs that this aggregate process might come to an end because, again, there is in certain important countries the possibility of winning the elections with an anti-globalization platform, whatever, because there has been COVID and so forth and so on. But there is also another point, which is that in the end, this depends on human beings and on what human beings do. So human agency is that. The intentional action of human beings. So to some degree, this is also a matter of decision. Then, of course, it's not like we'll ever vote globally on whether we want more or less globalization. This is something which then happens locally. And by the way in which global processes affect local politics is also something that we will discuss based on the book by Branko Milanovic later on in the course. It is actually pretty important when you think about the political consequences of current trends in global inequality, basically. And in globalization also. But again, we will keep this for the final part of the course. And again, when does globalization begin? Now, in this case, we will take a very long-run approach again, because we will begin with a kind of proto-globalization, of which we find some hints in pretty ancient time, but in general, we can think that this process begins with the opening of the Atlantic trade routes at the end of the 15th century. And what do these Atlantic trade routes do? Well, they connect economies around the world which were basically separated before, save for some, again, earlier connections paths like the Silk Road, which existed from Roman times. The Romans regularly exchanged embassies with the Han Empire in China, for example. But the point is how you go from something like that, in which, between Europe and China, the only connection path is the Silk Road. It's not easy to work that road, and only very few goods are valuable enough to be traded along that kind of commercial path. How do you move from that to something like that, which is kind of a representation of the interconnected companies of the 21st world? And this is a process. Again, we will start looking at this wave of globalization, of proto-globalization, from the end of the 15th century. And by looking at this in this way, we will understand better what is really new in the 19th century and then in the 20th and the 21st century, right? But there is also clearly a continuity in certain processes, which we will observe in some detail during the course. Divergence. What is divergence? It's basically what I referred to before, is the process leading certain areas to become richer in per capita terms, and also maybe politically, militarily more powerful and politically more influent than other world areas. And what we want to understand is how these came to be, and also from the other point of view, we want to know why certain world areas, like for example, Sub-Saharan Africa, didn't manage to keep the pace and tended to remain behind. I already introduced the idea of the great and data divergence. And let me say something more instead, before maybe moving directly to the discussion of the exam, about why we are interested in divergence. Now, there are some indicators which are usually used, like for example, per capita GDP, which, especially when applied to historical societies, maybe become a little bit difficult to interpret because they weren't meant to be produced for those societies. Not like when you see, when you see an estimate of per capita GDP in, say, the Roman Empire in the year 100, or the Common Era, you should remember that GDP is something which has been developed for an industrial economy of the 20th or 21st century as a measure. But the point is that those indicators, also for how they've been produced, also tell us something about other relevant features of a society, which are maybe more interesting. Like, for example, life expectancy at birth or relative levels of health. Interestingly, these two things are strongly correlated. Let me see whether this works. I'm not sure this will work. So the students at home can see this or not? No, they can't. Okay. So I will explain you what to do instead of showing you this now, also for reasons of time. Click the link you will find in the slides, and you get to Gapminder, and look at what happens if you chart life expectancy at birth, which is an indicator of health in general, and per capita GDP or levels of income, and you have the last 2 centuries. And the dynamic you will observe graphically will tell you a lot about the actual meaning of divergence. Now, I don't think I can do this effectively without losing the part of the class which is connected from remote, so I will not do this. And also, this is also because I think we will continue tomorrow with the part on inequality, and today instead we'll talk about the evaluation of this course, okay? So we will go back to that later. I also realize now that the conversion of my PowerPoint on this platform creates problems, so tomorrow I will share the PDF, because there are a number of irritating graphical mistakes that the conversion is producing. Okay, so this is already discussed. Okay, now, you might have checked this, of course, before enrolling in this course, but let's have a discussion of the way in which this course is evaluated, so we can also ask me questions. Be aware of the fact that for each item of the evaluation, I will provide you more information later in the course. Like, for example, there will be a moment when I will come to class and show you, discuss with you, an example of midterm exam, for example, right? Because I always use the same format. And there are other components of the evaluation, which also will be the subject of more discussion later. But in general, for the students who take the exam for attending students, and I think this is basically the case for all of you who are here, and I kind of strongly recommend that if you actually attend the course, you take the course as an attending student. And this doesn't necessarily mean doing the partial exams. It means doing the group work and the presentation of the group work in class at the end of the course, okay? So, for those who take the partial exams, you will have the first big partial weighing 40% of the final mark, then a second partial exam in May or in June. You have 2 dates for the second partial, which weighs 25%. And again, this is because we will have in practice fewer lectures in the second half of the course, because we also have the presentation in class and whatever. And then the group project. The group project accounts for 35% of the final mark, divided in this way. 25% go to the actual written, say, paper, and 10% go to the presentation in class. Now, this is a group project and a collective effort, so the mark is the same for all the members of the group. Okay? And if you ask me why I evaluate specifically the presentation in class, I'll tell you, well, this is because in this university we are doing an effort to improve the soft skills of our students, which include, of course, being able to talk to a class and to present something. And this also kind of makes things more interesting, if you want, at the moment of the presentation. Like that's extra thrill in presenting your work, which is, of course, a joke. Or you take the general exam, which weighs 65% of the total, plus the presentation in class. Of course, the group work has to be presented at the end of the course. So in that case, you don't have option. You will have the possibility of deciding, we can negotiate which day exactly will deliver your presentation, but this is for people who might have something similar in other courses. We will have, I think, 2 dates for this, and then you will, I mean, if I don't get too many requests for a specific date, I will be able to accommodate all of your requests, right? It becomes Otherwise, it becomes a very difficult process for me. And then again, this is collected. Something which I don't know is whether this will have to be done in a hybrid format. Probably yes, so at least on principle, let's say that fully remote presentations, so people who, groups who are composed exclusively of students connected from remote, will also be possible. I expect that this year, most of the groups will actually be physically present in class to deliver their presentation. Of course, if the pandemic allows us to do that, I will not say anything because we are in Italy and we want to be scaramantici, as we say. Anyway, the point is, given that the future is uncertain, as we said before, we keep this possibility, which doesn't have any specific setback. So it's a matter of necessity for some groups, and then we will do that. Beyond this, and all these are compulsory components of the evaluation. So there are, basically 4 items for those doing the partial exams. First partial exam, second partial exam, presentation, and paper. The final 2 are marks assigned collectively to the group, or 3 for those students who do the general exam, and then that's the merger of the partial, or the first and second partial, in terms of the material to cover at the moment of the written exam. And of course, all exams are written, and so forth and so on. Beyond this, however, there is also an optional component for attending students only. This is what I call the descriptive report. What is this? At the end of the first part of the course, you will have the option of selecting one word area or region of your interest and write what I call, again, a descriptive report, covering the development of that area or region in the perspective of the great divergence and of globalization during at least 3.5 centuries, so beginning at least circa 1500 to circa 1850. So this is strictly on the, say, pre-industrial phase, save for some relatively few countries which started going through the industrialization process already from the middle of the 18th century or the beginning of the 19th in the end. And again, we will discuss what I mean by descriptive report in a future lecture. The point, however, is that those who submit it will have to send the report to me by March 19. This is individual. And then on March 21st, they might be required to present in class again their work. This is not something which will happen for everybody, because I will select maybe 2 or 3 of you that day to do the presentation, which isn't receiving a specific mark, but if you aren't in class for delivering it, unless you have the possibility of demonstrating causes of force majeure, you are not given a mark. So you have, increased your knowledge, but not improved your final mark, alas. Okay? So the point is the following. You have to be in class and be ready to present it. And the presentation must be very short, exactly 7 minutes. It is a different exercise in presentation, because I'm telling you that when you're presenting something complex in very little time, it is much more difficult than having, say, half an hour. So the complexity here is at 2 levels. First, you have to cover a very broad topic in very few words. because there will be a hard constraint on how long these descriptive reports have to be. And if you are called to present it, you must present it in a very brief and possibly very effective way. What's the advantage in doing this? Well, the final mark on the descriptive report varies in between 0 and 1, and adds up to your final mark from all the other components. So if you get 0, it doesn't change anything. You can't make your final mark worse. If the project is good, if the descriptive report is good, you get 0.5, which might lead to an improvement in your final mark or not, depending on the weighting of all the items, or 1, which means 1 full point on top of that. These are the rules of the game. If you don't like the rules of this game, you don't play it because it's optional. Okay? We have time for talking about this. There are questions about this, or also questions in general about the course? As I said, we will discuss each item evaluation in due time. No questions? Also from home? I've been exceedingly clear in my presentation of everything today. Questions? No. Okay. Sad for me. I was hoping for questions. So very quickly, let's say something about inequality, so tomorrow we can move directly to our prehistorical whatever discussion, okay? As I mentioned, we will, I'm sorry. So this is a graphical glitch because of the platform. Again, I forgot that I probably should have uploaded directly the PDF version also for the purposes of this. Okay, my fault. Tomorrow it will be a PDF. So we define inequality as a condition of disparity in the distribution of income or of economic assets, or of wealth, if you want. What does this mean? That you will have, generally speaking, no inequality in a hypothetical situation in which everybody gets, no income inequality in the hypothetical situation in which everybody earns the same income. It's more difficult to define the opposite, basically, but we will discuss that in detail, because when you think about income, if you think about a stable society, you can't think that people will get zero income because they will die otherwise, literally starve to death. So the point is, what is the actually socially possible maximum inequality? Well, that's a question to which we will answer by looking into the concept of the so-called maximum possible inequality, which basically is the theoretical maximum you obtain when you give the subsistence income to everybody, save for one individual who gets all the surplus above subsistence. Right? So it's kind of a way of thinking about the level of inequality compared to the theoretical maximum you can achieve without exterminating your population, basically. As I said, it's much easier to define the absence of inequality than to define what is actually the maximum possible inequality you can experience, right? And then, of course, you can measure inequality at the level of individuals or households, and you can measure inequality at the level of regions, nations, and whatever. And we will do both. And we will also see how you can measure, at least on principle, inequality between areas and within areas with specific indexes, specific methods, and also how you can actually decide whether the general changes in inequality you are observing depend on regions becoming more uneven in terms, for example, of their per capita income, or individuals within regions becoming more unequal compared to their fellow citizens within, again, each single region or state. And Of course, when you think about this, when you think about inequality between different regions, this idea connects very directly with that of divergence. Because if you have divergence between world regions, on principle, you might expect that inequality between those regions is also increasing. Of course, then the problem becomes that when you have, for example, divergence between, say, the West and the rest, which is a very old-fashioned way of posing this, but this is only to make the case, the example of a condition in which you have a relatively small group of rich countries which start to grow at a quicker pace compared to the rest of the world, you can expect that inequality at the world level would increase. Although in practice, this is not necessarily the case in a transitory phase in which, for example, the countries in the rich group becomes more equal between themselves, so become more similar one to the other, and the countries in the other part, in the other group also become more similar one to the other. Okay? So the final outcome depends on how different elements mix. And as I always say, inequality measures are easy to learn but difficult to master, because when you start really thinking about what's going on with your distributions, which might be, again, each regions or the individuals within a society, you realize that there is usually much more to say and much more also to study to understand than you might have thought otherwise. And on principle, you could also have inequality within, again, groups and inequality between groups going into exactly the opposite directions. Okay, this is already discussed. I think we can finish here. And let me conclude this course, this lecture, with this point. We started with these three big keywords. So globalization, divergence, and inequality. The connection between these three concepts are not obvious. So some seem to be more natural than others, like, for example, the connection between divergence and inequality, right? But again, as I was observing before, the way in which these broad divergence processes translate into changes in inequality measures is much less direct than you might imagine. Because again, this depends, I mean, the final outcome depends on the relative movement within regions also. When you think about globalization and divergence, or when you think about globalization and inequality, again, things become more complicated. Because, for example, there is not a consensus on the way in which globalization might lead to inequality changes within countries. This is something which is relatively little studied also, and in general it will become it is a specific purpose of this course to try and bring these keywords together, looking for connections which are not that obvious, and we will try and do this in a complex way. So the point is, on principle, I could come to class and give you the story of humankind in the version which I personally prefer. Right? But I will not do that, because that's not useful for you, in a sense. What we will do in this course is looking together at certain crucial historical processes, looking at few things which we can kind of agree are solid, and then we will realize that in every case, those relatively few solid bits of evidence can lead to very different interpretations of those processes. There is very little in human history in which there is almost general consensus. Very, very, very little, right? And we will not, shy away from that. We will look at directly contrasting interpretations sometimes. We will look at potentially divisive interpretation, we will discuss, and everybody can have her or his own opinion about this. Again, the only point is you need to be able to argue for that if you really want to kind of contribute that opinion to class. Okay? We will talk about topics which have sometimes the possibility to be read, to be given a political reading, but we will not talk about politics in this class, right? So everybody is entitled to have her or his personal political opinion. That's not something which is relevant here. Of course, some of the topics which we cover are potentially political, but we will try and see at different facets. And however, I will try and also make it clear how if you, in the context of a discourse, stick to a certain interpretation and not to another, you're also intrinsically giving sometimes a reading of that process which can be used politically in a certain way, right? So again, this is an apolitical course in which, however, we are going to tackle the issue of the political use of history. That's it. We will consider how history can be used for building a political discourse, but we are not kind of starting with a pre-concept idea. And this is because, again, you don't have to agree with me. That's the point. You are entitled to have your own opinion. Only thing, of course, if you come to me and tell me that, Columbus reached America in 1844, I might disagree with that, say. Okay, so you have time maybe for a final question. Otherwise, I will see you all in class tomorrow. Yes? About? Absolutely, yes. I couldn't hear you. Okay, what kinds of questions? Now, very briefly, because I will come to class and we'll talk about that, I usually do this. I give 2 compulsory questions, which are pretty broad. Not really essay questions, but you are asked to answer on with maybe 1 or 2 pages for each one of these. And they are on kind of broad topics, like, for example, what are the institutional explanations of the little divergence, or same, but of the great divergence. And then I give a set of kind of more focused questions to which you can answer with in between a few lines or maximum half a page. And I always give the opportunity to drop one of these. So these are usually like 4, and you have to choose 3, right? But I will, and this is the format that I will use for the first partial exam, the second, and also the general. The difference with the general is that you will get half the questions about the first part of the program and half about the second part of the program. And the exam is meant to be relatively compact. I will provide you with examples, of course, and we'll talk more about this in class as well, okay? Specifically. Other questions? Okay, so if there are no other questions, not even from home, see you tomorrow, okay? And I'll stop recording now. And the slides are already in the Blackboard space.